Welcome to the Studio Art Department at Bethany Lutheran College. Bethany is a special place for artists. Here we learn to witness in a visual culture and become good stewards of our God-given talents. So I'll clean off my fork as much as I can, set it aside, and remember that it's wet plaster, so don't set it on something and stain it. Now this plaster is on its way to setting, and it's taking on kind of a creamy consistency. I'm going to pour it into this coffee bag that I have suspended in a plastic bucket. The bucket is extra insurance. If this coffee bag leaks, you've got a big mess in your hands, and it's really nice to contain it just as a backup. I've got a clamp to the bucket. It should be fairly secure. I'm just going to pour and use my knife to kind of clean out. I can smell the coffee from this bag now. Try to work as clean as you can. Okay. Now after you pour, there might be air bubbles in your mold, so I'm just going to give this a little shake or tap it a little bit, and that just causes air bubbles to come off any of the side of the mold, and then we just let that set. I'm trying to be able to pour several molds with one batch here. So I've got a large bowl. This is an old basketball. Make sure that you mix thoroughly. Don't want any dry pockets in here. Alright, that's good for that one. I'm going to go into this food container, and that will be my whole batch. This is a rubber silicone kitchen spatula. This does a really nice job of scraping the walls of this bowl so that you can maximize the plaster and not waste too much. Now the mold material matters. So I'm pouring into some different kinds of materials here. This particular one is, I would call it semi-rigid. It's kind of a waxed cardboard. This is a container for Chinese food. Sometimes a milk carton or orange juice carton has the same kind of consistency. It's kind of a white cardboard with a shiny, waxy finish. This will do a good job for a mold. This is a plastic takeout bowl, and I'm kind of shaking the bubbles loose from the walls, tapping the sides of the mold, tapping it down before it gets too set. Now this one, notice I've taped this so it doesn't fall apart, and I'm only about halfway filled on this container. If I'm quick, I can mix another batch and safely add it to this semi-wet plaster. But if I wait a day and then pour into the same place, it will bond for a while, but it could have a weak spot at that seam. So it's a good idea to finish filling while you're at it. Do it all at the same time. I'm going to mix another batch. All right, so I've got some a fresh batch of plaster still in this bowl, and I can mix again. I can just put some water in there, and if that water's a little milky, it's not going to make a big difference. I'm kind of dripping some water here, and I'm really glad I've got a cover on my plaster because that kind of stuff can happen, and if drops of water get into your plaster source, they'll start to set. That dry powder will start to set. So protect your dry plaster, please. Keep it dry. With practice, you get better and better at estimating. You get faster at mixing plaster. This is just part of being a sculptor. It's really a skill that you have to get used to. This sort of on-the-fly estimating, it makes you go a lot faster if you can eyeball the mix and just keep an eye on this dry mountain. Something I didn't mention earlier, it's really important, don't disturb the bowl. So if I'm trying to estimate like this dry mountain and then I pick it up and move it or shake the bowl, my measurement system is shot and that batch won't work. You won't be able to use this dry island estimation if you disturb it. It needs to be untouched. So don't bump the table, don't bump the bowl. Just be aware of your surroundings, be careful. This is looking like it's about where I want to be for my mix. So the sinking is slow. I'm not in a hurry. I don't want to be in a panic here. So I want to make sure that this batch is going to work. Okay, this looks good. I'll give that a thorough mix. I mentioned earlier that the temperature of the water matters, and here's why. Plaster warms. It gets warm as it sets. And so, if you want your plaster to set quickly, use warm water or hot water. And that will just accelerate the setting time. On the contrary, if you want plaster to be open for a longer time, to stay liquid and to kind of slow down that setting process, use cold water, and then it will take longer for that heat to accumulate. So when you're pouring a mold or working with plaster, every now and then just check the temperature of it, feel it, and you'll feel that it's giving off heat. Okay, I want to make sure that I thoroughly mix this so I don't have any very watery sections, so I don't have any dry lumps in there. Scrape the walls, make sure I'm getting the bottom. Tap off the tool, set it aside carefully. I can tap the walls too, just to release any air bubbles. I'm going to come back carefully, not spilling. Before I pour this, I want to show you the consistency. So here's this mold that I was recently pouring liquid plaster into. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to stick a tool in there and kind of show you the consistency that it's at now. So I lift some of this out. This is starting to take on kind of a broken cottage cheese or ice cream consistency. So it's becoming semi-solid in there. It's still kind of liquidy, right? But it's on its way. It's transforming. So I can still safely pour and top off this mold. Now if this mold fails, if it breaks, say my tape doesn't hold or there's a hole in it, suddenly there's plaster all over my feet and all over the floor. Be aware of that potential. Okay? That's really a panicky moment. Try to prevent it. Be smart about it. You might put some kind of a tray around this, a baking sheet or something along those lines. All right, I'm going to kind of shake the bubbles out, and then let it be. This is more of a rigid form, and the nice thing about it is, first of all, you just get to buy some chips. This is a nice cylinder form, and then we can just peel off. We can just cut and peel off of this form after it's set. If you've got some cooking spray handy, that's a good mold release. You can spray just a little bit in here, and you get kind of a nicer release. That's especially important with the base here. This could bond. Plaster is a pretty good bond. I'm just gonna pour while I can. You do always have to be aware that plaster, once you start mixing it, plaster is on its way to solid. So plan your workspace ahead of time. Do all the preparation you can so that when your plaster is wet, you can just proceed. You want to be calm but urgent. Get as much out of here as I can. This is about half full. I'll come back and top that off and get a nice plaster pillar out of this. Shake out the bubbles while it's liquid and active. If you end up with too much plaster in your mix, this is really important for you to think about and understand. You can't add water. That's especially true after you start mixing. So if you sneak a little water in before you start stirring, I think that's okay. It's not a good practice, but it's okay. You kind of lose your measurement estimate. So it's kind of like if you disturb the plaster, you lose your measurement. If you add water after you've started adding powder, you lose your measurement. But now, after I've mixed, if I want to add water to this, it won't combine. It won't combine very well at all. It'll be very difficult to do. Don't rely on that. Try to get the measurement right by adding gradually. Okay, and really pay attention to what you're doing. That's one of the most important things I can say to you when it comes to working with plaster. Just pay attention to what you're doing. Think about your surroundings. What's the potential for the mess here? Keep your tools clean. Keep your work area clean. And just realize that mixing plaster starts a ticking clock. Okay, so you are on a timer. You don't check your phone. You don't do anything distracting during this time. You need to focus. I'm just going to top that one off while it's still wet. Add wet to wet. And we will come back to these and open them up. And I'm going to finish up with this bubble wrap mailer. So this is a paper mailer, and it's really important that you realize this is not just paper. I'm not just pouring into an envelope. You need a non-porous surface. So plastic is probably the easiest surface to release, or some waxed cardboard or paper. Notice that I'm suspending this, and I've got it in a bucket just in case it leaks. I can't guarantee. I don't know if this will leak or not. So I like to have a little insurance that I don't get toes full of plaster, because once plaster goes, it can gravity will take it to its lowest point. All right. So broken mold can be really kind of a panic situation. This will take some more plaster to fill up, but it looks like it's holding. So this is a flexible mold, this envelope. Another example of a flexible mold would be this coffee bean bag. They're sturdy enough to hold their shape, or to hold the plaster, but flexible so that they form some really kind of interesting, almost organic shapes. I think that's kind of a fascinating experiment to see what kind of shape would this soft mold make. So here's an example of plaster that's been poured into a coffee bean bag, and you can see there's still kind of the soft, wrinkly, kind of bulging form here, and I've started to cut into it. In this case, you see the color change. Each mix of plaster, I put a little bit of dye into. So in this case, I had some purple, and then this was just plain white. But I poured them simultaneously, and that takes a little bit of preparation to have several bowls, 2 mixes at the same time. But then as you carve it, you get this nice kind of marbling throughout. And I think of this kind of like a stone that's been quarried, and you as a sculptor then are presented with interesting shapes and some veining, and you kind of discover the block and compose according to it. This is poured from a cardboard box, and you can see there's a bulge to all of these forms. It all kind of swells out because the plaster is exerting pressure on the mold. Generally, I don't recommend plain cardboard molds. I think they're going to leak. They're going to absorb the plaster and change the consistency of it. So whenever you can, try to use something that is non-absorbent, plastic or waxed cardboard, and just keep your eyes open for something in the recycling bin. This might be a really great way to reuse something for an artistic purpose. Maintaining your plaster tools is really something you have to keep on top of, because remember, plaster turns solid. So it will turn solid on anything it touches, any of its tools. Fortunately, it's not that hard to scrape off, but it's a whole lot easier to clean it before it sets. So I recommend, what I do is I keep my water close by for mixing plaster, but I use that same container to just soak my tools in between batches. So I'll just leave my tools sit in there, and if that water gets milky and if it's got some plaster in it, it's not that big of a deal for the mix. It doesn't really matter. So for containers, you don't need to worry about cleaning while the plaster is wet. Don't wipe it out with a paper towel or anything. You'll just be wasting towels. They'll just turn crusty. Just let it set, and then we'll just crack that out into garbage. But your tools, if you have a flexible tool like this, you can do the same thing. You can let that set and just crumble it off, or use another tool to kind of scrape it off and let those crumbs be in a container that you're going to dump later. All right? And now maybe the frugal artist in you can't stand throwing away anything, even little crumbs like this. And if that's true, you can collect plaster crumbs. And sculptors call this Ludo, L-U-D-O, Ludo. And you can use that as fill for when you're filling molds. You pour in your mold, and then you add some crumbs to it and kind of shake it, and it extends that mold. It's like an aggregate. But also, it accumulates and can just become garbage and the potential for mess, all right? So try to keep your tools and your workspace as clean as you can. Because not only does it prevent mess from happening in your surroundings, but it also improves your work. Your work gets better when your tools and your workspace are cleaner. Hard tools like this, metal tools, definitely take some maintenance. You gotta kind of scrape them off, so it's helpful to have a couple tools handy, and you can use one tool to scrape one, kind of rinse it, and then use the other tool to scrape the other. Keep these nice and clean. Alright, so like I said, if this water turns kind of milky, no big deal. We're just going to use that in our next mix of plaster. Alright, take care of your tools, they'll take care of you. If you've got some dry powder or water on your workspace, or if you spilled, be glad that you've got some plastic down. You can just kind of dry up any water with a towel or a sponge. If you have a spill, if you've spilled some plaster on the plastic, just like with the bowls, let it set and then it will crack off and you can throw the solid in the garbage. Dry powder, you can kind of gather up. It's tempting to try to put this back into your mix, but really, really be careful that you don't add any moisture. You don't want to add any moisture into your dry powder source. So I would just pick this plastic up and dump it into the garbage. I think it's not worth the risk. Okay, I'm going to check these molds, and here's another rule of thumb. You'll know when you can demold based on the sound that the plaster makes. So take a metal tool and lightly sort of touch and scrape the top surface. Now this is still kind of a soft cheese consistency, so this is not ready. Just tap this. It doesn't make any sound, and it's still semi-liquid, so not quite ready yet. All right, so let's take a look at this. I'm back, and when I scrape a metal tool across this plaster, I can feel it's warm, and I listen. It's making a scraping sound, and that tells me that it's ready, so that we can demold. Okay, so the other molds also make this scraping sound. I can even reach down into the plastic bag and hear it. Okay, so it's really important that a plaster mold has what's called draft. So we can illustrate that pretty easily on this bowl. Notice that these sides are not vertical, but they're tilted. So it's important when you pour into something that's plaster, or that we're going to release plaster from, a mold like this should just pop out. Let's see what happens if I just kind of drop it. Sometimes it comes out like that. I might be able to push down from the top. Get it to release. And there, I just felt it fall off. Now I made a suction cup. So there, didn't clean out my bowl very well. I've got a little Chinese food left in my plaster. We'll carve that out later. But isn't that cool? It picked up all the detail, all the surface, and even the type from the bottom of that container. All right, so there's that one. That was from a rigid mold. Here's from a softer semi-rigid. I'm just gonna cut this with a knife carefully. I kind of cut along the seam. Got my apron on. Be careful that you don't cut yourself or your clothing. Just kind of work that seam open carefully. Peel it back, and that is probably all I need. Otherwise, I can cut again. This might just tear. And this one I would throw away. We won't use that again. So, what a beautiful form. Look at the way this kind of bulges and the way the light kind of plays across it. Again, kind of a tapered form. Our cylinder. Look closely at a package like this. It's assembled in a spiral, and so I can find a seam here all the way at the top. Kind of detect where the overlap is, and I'll make my cut at that seam. Hopefully I got it right. So if I kind of peel this down and away, I should be able to get all the way around and release this form. Might need to encourage it a bit. Curious about what's going to happen at the bottom here. Oh, it did release. Chips were probably oily enough. So here's a nice cylindrical form. It came out of this free mold, semi-free. You got to buy the chips. What a nice form for carving. It's like a pillar. Let's try this bag. If I find a seam, I might be able to just peel that open, release the aroma of coffee grounds. Wow, look at that. So some of the folds are worked into the plaster, and this can and should inform the kind of shape that you carve from this. So treat this as if it's a natural rock, and you have to react to it. So the mold kind of makes suggestions, and you look at it and you think, okay, what could this become? It's kind of like looking at clouds and thinking about what do I see in there if I modify this a little bit? What could this turn into? We got this shipping envelope. I didn't put much plaster in here. I kind of wish I would have filled it more, but let's take a look at what's inside. Let's see, there's just stuff way at the bottom. And actually, I've never done this before. I like this mold. Let's see what it does. Wow. Really a interesting, wrinkly surface on there. The bubble wrap's got a glossy influence. You see traces of the circles on there. So I think I might want to try this again and fill it up more. That would be a very interesting form, but just had a little bit of extra plaster and poured it in there to give it a try. Okay, so some of these forms are garbage. I would not reuse these soft or semi-soft forms, but a form like this kind of plastic form is just fine. This would make a great mixing bowl, plaster mixing bowl, and it could be reused basically until it breaks. So here's our collection of ready-made plaster forms. We didn't do much for mold making. It was really just stuff that came out of the recycling bin. And now we've got blanks that we can carve and we can work on our carving skills in a relatively easy to carve medium, and we can make some surprising forms to give us a jump start on that carving.